The massive German counterattack in the Ardennes forest region of Belgium in December of 1944, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, was one of the largest battles in which the U.S. Army ever participated. The Battle of the Bulge is fairly well known, especially the defense of the Belgian crossroad town of Bastogne, but arguably the much less well known defense by the outnumbered troops of the U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions at a place called Elsenborn Ridge was more important. Despite being not nearly as well known as the battered bastards of Bastogne, historian and second son of the Allied Supreme Commander, John S.D. Eisenhower, wrote that the actions of the 2nd and 99th on the northern shoulder could be considered to be the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. On the 40th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, the New York Times wrote, "The furious initial success of the Germans shattered conventional military wisdom in London and Paris that the war was almost over." 6 months after the Allied invasion at Normandy, the Western Allies had thought that they held superiority along the Western Front, believing the German army to be inexorably on the defensive. But there was a weakness in their lines, and the Americans knew it. The Germans had moved quickly through the Ardennes forest in 1940, yet despite that historic use of the route, the forest was only being lightly defended. The U.S. 99th Infantry Division was a reserve division that did not deploy overseas until October of 1944. Composed of the 394th, 395th, and 396th Infantry Regiments and support elements, the division was, in December of 1944, yet to see combat. While their nickname was the Checkerboard Division, owing to the pattern on the division patch that had been derived from the coat of arms of William Pitt, their inexperience in combat showed in the name later bestowed upon them in the American press, the Battle Babies. The 99th was deployed to the Ardennes Forest, thought by the Allies to be a secondary front where, the website Traces of War explains, newly arrived divisions could get used to front life and battered divisions could rest and recuperate. The Ardennes was an area of rest, warm food, hot showers, and entertainment. The general attitude was explained in a letter home written on December 15th by Private Joe Scheckman, a radio operator from Scranton, stationed near the town of Bastogne. "We are quartered here as comfortable and safe as in England. Of course, I can't say how long we will remain in this paradise, but as long as I am here, I am safe." But the position was precarious. The 99th was spread thin, with each of its 3 regiments responsible for defending nearly 7 miles of line, something that the commander of the 395th, Lieutenant Colonel McClernand Butler, described as 3 to 4 times wider than recommended by Army textbooks. The division was spread so thin that all 3 regiments had to be placed in the line, leaving no reserves. The weakness was known to Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group. When in early December, Major General Troy Middleton, commander of the U.S. 8th Corps, expressed his concern about the thinness of the defense in the area, Bradley replied, "Don't worry, Troy, they won't come through here." To which Middleton replied, "Maybe not, Brad, but they've come through this area several times before." The Times wrote, when questioned by this correspondent at the time about the thinness of the American deployment, Bradley said, "It's a calculated risk. You have to take them in war." One of his staff officers added, "After all, these aren't the Germans of 1940. But Hitler had his own plans. The plans for a massive counterattack in the West had come from Hitler himself. The Fuhrer had revealed his plans to his generals in September. The Times writes, "Like many of Hitler's projects, the Ardennes offensive was grandiose in its objectives. The Nazi dictator saw the seizure of Antwerp, which could logistically support at least 50 Allied divisions in a drive into Germany, as the primary objective. But he also believed that by driving between the American 12th Army Group north of Spa and the British 21st Army Group in northern Belgium and the Netherlands, he would place the British in an intolerable military situation. With their backs against the sea and no access to a major supply port, they would be forced to withdraw across the North Sea to Britain." Reportedly, many generals tried to talk Hitler out of the plan, which would redeploy altogether some 400,000 troops, some 13 infantry and 7 armored divisions, 3 whole army groups, as well as thousands of tanks, assault guns, and other armored vehicles, and more than 4,000 artillery pieces, mostly from the war against the Soviets in the East. Realizing Allied air power, the offensive was planned for December in hopes of the weather limiting air operations. It was an enormous risk of men and supply and a desperate gambit. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, in overall command of the Western Front, wrote in his orders of the day, "We risk everything." And the hardest thrust of the offensive was aimed right at the battle babies of the 99th Division. The northern end of the battle was critically important to the quick timetable of the offensive. The German timetable depended upon speed to limit the Allies' ability to reinforce or counterattack. What came to be called the Northwest Shoulder, near the Belgian mountain town of Elsenborn, protected routes of travel that the offensive was to use in their dash towards Antwerp. Moreover, the route included major Allied supply depots, whose materials, especially fuel, the Germans expected to capture in order to sustain the offensive. As important, the Germans needed to deny those roads and crossroads to the Allies, limiting their ability to move troops and respond. Hitler himself chose his most powerful veteran units, and priority of supply was given to them. The Americans had no idea what was coming. The Times wrote, "Surprise is the key to military success. The Germans used it masterfully. Not only were they able to concentrate a force of more than 23 divisions close to the American front, but they also managed to assemble the necessary stocks of ammunition and fuel without detection." Despite their inexperience, the men of the 99th, under the command of Major General Walter E. Lauer, had time to prepare strong defensive positions, including pre-registering artillery, that is, having prepared coordinates for artillery to attack where defenders saw likely avenues of attack. Important to the defensive was a boomerang-shaped ridgeline rising some 2,000 feet above sea level called Elsenborn Ridge. The National World War II Museum explains, at precisely 0530 hours, the force erupted in an ear-shattering German artillery barrage along a 100-mile front. In the northern portion of the American line, heavy artillery shells crashed around the positions of the untested 99th Infantry Division. A major in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division remembered, "We old soldiers had seen many a heavy barrage, but never before anything like this." Caught by surprise in the initial attack, communication lines were disrupted, limiting the ability for the 99th to call artillery. German units broke through the lines, and small units were isolated. Staff Sergeant Vernon McGarity was a squad leader in L platoon of the 99th 393rd Infantry Regiment. Severely wounded in the face and legs in the initial artillery barrage, he was taken to an aid station, but he refused to be evacuated and returned to his men. A citation would later read, "The fury of the enemy's Great Western Front offensive swirled around the position held by Tech Sergeant McGarity's small force. But so tenaciously did these men fight on orders to stand firm at all costs that they could not be dislodged, despite murderous enemy fire and the breakdown of their communications. McGarity was in the center of the fight, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded comrades, retrieve munitions, break up an armored attack by disabling a tank with a bazooka, and single-handedly clearing a German machine gun position. The sergeant and his men held until they literally ran out of ammunition. The Germans captured the men, but the citation writes, McGarity supported a remarkable delaying action, which provided the time necessary for assembling reserves and forming a line against which the German striking power was shattered." The brave stand was representative of the men of the 99th that day. Outnumbered some 8-1, though forced back, the line held. McGarity and his men were taken as POWs and liberated the following April. The next year he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Another remarkable stand came near a Belgian village called Lanzarote. There, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, just 18 men under the command of First Lieutenant Lyle J. Bouck, Jr., had dug in. Military Intelligence Bulletin writes, "The position offered good observation to the highway, which ran north through Lanzarote to the main defensive positions of the regiment. But the position also sat on the vital flank of the 99th. They occupied foxholes that had previously been dug by another unit and had time to develop a strong defensive position, defended by light and medium machine guns, as well as one heavy 50 caliber machine gun mounted on a jeep. The initial shelling disrupted their landline to the regimental headquarters, but the men received little damage in their well-prepared foxholes. Facing a German paratrooper battalion, the well-prepared position of Bouck's platoon was able to defeat several frontal attacks. Bouck called for artillery support, but none was available, as the 99th was being attacked all along the line. The platoon held for nearly 20 hours before, their ammunition nearly exhausted. A group of paratroopers flanked their position, and they were captured." The bulletin writes, "The engagement at Lanzarote was over, but its effect was astounding. The 18 men of the I&R platoon had inflicted between 400 and 500 casualties, decimating an entire battalion of the German 3rd Parachute Division. The platoon had halted the mission of the paratroopers to rapidly break through the American front and allow armored units of the German main effort, the 6th Panzer Army, immediate access to open roads toward the Meuse River. As with McGarity's stand, the defense at Lanzarote had significantly delayed the timetable of the offensive, and had given time for the Allies to move reinforcements. Without the stand of the I&R platoon, the 99th flank may have been turned. Because of their capture and the general chaos at the start of the attack, the Battle of Lanzarote was nearly forgotten. 37 years later, it was General Eisenhower's son, John, whose work as a historian discovered details of the action. The platoon was finally awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for the action in 1981. Despite heavy losses, the men of the 99th held. They were soon joined by the men of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division. The veteran division had been sent to capture a crossroads in preparation for a future attack. That battle came to be called the Battle of Heartbreak Crossroads. The men of the 2nd had overcome a determined German defense and finally held the crossroads on the 15th. When the German barrage came on the 16th, they assumed it was in retaliation for their offensive. But soon they found themselves in the middle of the massive German attack. After defending against several attacks, the men of the 2nd were told to withdraw to reinforce the 99th. Private First Class Richard Cowan was manning a machine gun. A citation wrote of his action. He was a heavy machine gun gunner in a section attached to Company I, 17 December 1944, when that company was attacked by a numerically superior force of German infantry and tanks. The first 6 waves of hostile infantrymen were repulsed with heavy casualties, but a 7th drive with tanks killed or wounded all but 3 of his section, leaving Private Cowan to man his gun, supported only by 15 to 20 riflemen of Company I. Manning his gun alone, he protected the company's withdrawal, even making a stand against a massive King Tiger tank, devastating the infantry supporting the tank even as shells landed all around him. The citation reads, Private Cowan was the last man to leave, voluntarily covering the withdrawal of his remaining comrades. His heroic actions were entirely responsible for allowing the remaining men to retire successfully from the scene of their last-ditch stand. The 22-year-old successfully escaped with his men, but he was killed the following day. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The men of the 99th and 2nd were slowly pushed back to defensive positions along Elsenborn Ridge, but despite being greatly outnumbered, they held there in a strong defensive position. They had close calls and at times called up regimental staff and clerks to defend the line, but they had an advantage. Behind the ridge was the artillery support for an entire Army corps, over 300 heavy artillery pieces, including 155 mm, 105 mm, 75 mm, and 4.2-inch chemical mortars. The National World War II Museum writes, incredible heavy artillery fire dropped onto the Germans like rain. The office of the Chief of Military History of the Department of the Army wrote that the American battle here exemplifies a high order of coordination and cooperation between the ground arms. Although the infantry almost single-handedly secured the ground and held it for the first few hours, the main German assaults were met and checked by infantry, tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery. The National World War II Museum writes, there was simply no way that anything could or ever would penetrate the ring of steel formed by the American infantry and their supporting artillery. Any future attack would be doomed to fail, as the others had before. The determined defense by the battle babies of the 99th, the veterans of the 2nd, and other units defending Elsenborn Ridge was critical to the Allied victory in the Ardennes. The defense had not only stalled the German advance and blocked the main thrust of the German attack, but it guaranteed the Allies freedom of action along the same roads that the Germans had hoped to use. Deprived of the supply dumps that they hoped to capture, the German offensive ran out of fuel. Referring to the more well-known defense of Bastogne, the National World War II Museum writes, and while the defense of the crossroads of hell was gallant to be sure, it was not the backbreaker that most people assume it to have been. The real crusher to the German offensive plans in the Ardennes occurred 46 miles northeast of Bastogne, in a small area consisting of a copse of small villages and a piece of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge. Some historians have contended that outnumbered 5-1, the men of the 99th inflicted estimated casualties on the Germans in the ratio of 18-1. In fact, while the American casualties, the 99th lost some 20% of its force, nearly 5,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, German casualties are uncertain. But German records show a loss of an astonishing 114 tanks in the battle. The area around Elsenborn Ridge was the only part of the massive Battle of the Bulge where the Germans failed to advance. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding general of the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote that the battle was lost there, saying the counteroffensive failed because our right flank ran its head against a wall. The website of the MIA project likened the defense to another during the decisive Battle of Gettysburg a century earlier. The defense of Elsenborn Ridge will remain in history as the Little Round Top of the Battle of the Bulge. What turned out, 80 years ago, to be a significant Allied victory easily could have worked out differently. The New York Times wrote that the German armor and infantry pouring out of the woods on December 16th shattered the comfortable confidence with which the Allies viewed their military situation. The Allies were surprised and came close to being defeated. Despite the importance of the defense of Elsenborn Ridge, the battle to the south, particularly the siege of Bastogne, is much better known. Perhaps the greatest reason is that Bastogne had been scheduled as an area for rest and reorganization, and thus there were many Allied war correspondents there, witness to a dramatic battle that was really only important because the Germans had already been held to the north. The defenders of Elsenborn Ridge simply had fewer witnesses, and yet their brave stand deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.